start now for the.
Oh, right.
So I'll go ahead and just do that.
I forgot that.
So, because what I really want to do is see if we can get to a place where people, I probably scared people away by asking them to write a doctrine, theological doctrine. But no one said they were scared, but I forget that sometimes, that people don't want to tell me that they're scared. So I will own that.
Rolling in, so maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's only a couple minutes, so I will probably go ahead and pause the recording for now. So, hello class, we will be coming back in a couple minutes.
Sounds good.
Let's go ahead and start, because I feel very lucky because I had a difficult morning, and I had a really bad allergy scenario today, and then I was afraid I was coming down with something, but it was just allergies. So I took a little more medicine than normal, and I feel fine. So I'm feeling lucky. So today we're gonna look at chapters 11 and 12. We're gonna look at some of the Bible passages that undergird the social gospel, and from there we will begin to just talk about what we make of the notions of sin and salvation, in hopes of us composing a usable definition of each that we could share, not just among ourselves, but even folks from different religious backgrounds. One of the things that I always push back against is the notion that somehow Unitarian Universalism is so unique and so different, or that we only end up talking to ourselves when that happens. That if we can't speak in theological ways, then we're not really part of the public conversation. And we have so much to add to the public conversation that I honestly believe we have gifts to offer the common American understanding of what sin and salvation are. So I really want us to be able to articulate it in ways that don't just have meaning to us, but actually sound and feel like religious dialogue to those who are not Unitarian Universalists. And so, as I said a moment ago, we're gonna focus just a little bit on what's in chapters 11 and 12. Do look at some of the Bible passages that support this, and then talk about these definitions. And then next week, we'll continue talking about definitions of sin and salvation, and then discuss what do we do with all this work that we've done together, because I don't like to leave all of this effort solely in the realm of abstraction and thought games. I don't mind playing mind games, but I want them to be applied to something eventually. So here we are. So I'm going to start the way I did last week, just picking out some things that spoke to me in the 2 chapters. And if there's anything that you wish to lift up, whether it's something that was particularly awesome or particularly confusing, make sure you stop me, and we will make sure that we do that. All right. So here we go. So here we are. So I'm looking in the very beginning of this chapter 11. And Rauschenbusch right away, this is the very first sentence, and he writes, in discussing the doctrine of sin, we face the fact that redemption will have to deal not only with the weakness of flesh and blood, but with the strength of principalities and powers. And that comes right out of the Christian scriptures. Paul speaking about some of the biggest obstacles towards righteousness are the principalities and powers, the government and the economic power that sometimes make it difficult to do what is right. All right, and then in the very next paragraph, he speaks about these superpersonal forces. Superpersonal just simply means it's not a single individual. It means beyond the single person. So he's talking about groups of human beings And he says when superpersonal forces are based on an evil principle or directed toward an evil purpose or corrupted by some controlling group interest, which is hostile to the common good, they are sinners of sublimer mold and they block the way of redemption. They are to us what demonic personalities were to earlier Christian minds. So he's getting away from cosmic evil. That's why he contrasts it with the demonic. And he claims next that men of religious vision have always seen social communities in that way. And this is important for us to remember how Rauschenbusch is trying to correct the common understanding of Christianity and of Judaism. In this next sentence, when he says, the prophets dealt with Israel and Judah, they're the two kingdoms of ancient Israel. With Moab and Assyria, they were the two neighboring kingdoms, Assyria especially being the more aggressive nation. As with the prophets dealt with these nations as with personalities having a continuous life and spirit and destiny. Jesus saw Jerusalem as a man might see a beloved woman. Well, this is not a very useful sentence. So basically what he's trying to say is that the ancients saw nations as sort of a person writ large. And what he reminds us, and we'll see this in our Bible study in the second third of our class tonight, that when the prophets are speaking about what is happening that's not righteous, they're not talking about individual behavior. They're not talking about us drinking too much, and they're not talking about us swearing. They're talking about nations that are not doing the righteous thing, that are exploiting the poor, that are not giving aid and comfort to the widow and the immigrant and the stranger and the sick. This is the most important thing to take from this book, this notion that the salvation is of the society and not necessarily solely of the individual. Rauschenbusch would never say that there isn't such a thing as personal salvation, but he says that has worked out, in ourselves. But with ourselves, what is really more important is how are we acting in such a way that we're trying to save society itself. Okay. Do me a favor, look and see if anyone's ever trying to give me a question, because I never see it, because that's how bad I am. All right, so yeah, and I've got all of these here. He goes on in this chapter to what I think, and you probably thought too, was a little bit simplistic comparison between capitalistic and cooperative social organization. And he never wants to be called a socialist, but he certainly sounds like one in this chapter. So let's look instead a little farther. I don't think that's as useful I really think some of this is a little bit utopian, frankly. However, let's see. I'm going to, so this is a few pages in, and this is the paragraph that begins with composite personalities. Page 114 in the text. And he connects an old adage, the love of money being the root of all evil. And he begins to make a more compelling argument in some ways. And he says, communities and nations fall into wild fits of anger and cruelty. They are vain and contemptuous of others. They lie and love lies. They sin against their critical conscience. These are also the temptations and dangers which every democracy will meet and from which it will recover with loss and some shame. But what I think is more interesting, we're a little farther down, it was the need of protecting wealth against property which made the courts and the criminal law so cruel in the past. This is an interesting thing. And then he And he brings in the theological aspect. He says it was theological superstition which started the epidemic of witch trials in Europe, but it was the large fees that fell to the lawyers and the informers which made that craze so enduring. So he's trying to remind us that, yes, sometimes people jump to conclusions and make mistakes or even make theological claims, but would give them legs, which give those mistakes, those bad ways, a chance to perpetuate and to last beyond the moment, is the fact that people gain money and power from following and perpetuating those bad tendencies. You know, he goes on to speak about how modern war has almost always been about money. All of these things, I think, are important to think about. And you know, he goes on to contrast, you know, the Reformation era abuses of the Catholic Church with what were called sinecures, which were basically positions within the church hierarchy, where folks basically didn't do much except make money. You know, they were in charge of managing groups of churches, or of collecting money for what was called indulgences, which were where people were promised that if you paid a certain amount of money, that, you know, a beloved one who had died might have a chance to be prayed out of purgatory and have a better chance of reaching heaven. It was a really fraught program that just created a lot of abuse. And really it was a lot of that financial abuse around the era of the Reformation, around the late 1400s, that prompted the rise of the Protestant Reformation. And so in some of these, you know, despite some of his utopian language and such, I think we can understand what he's trying to say here, and to see it as having some validity. I'm going to stop my bit here and see if anybody has any questions or insights on that chapter 11 that they would like to lift up. Yes, Deb, go ahead.
To just say, because it's so new to me, I didn't find it simplistic and had never thought of that capitalist cooperative, one person, one vote, or one share. But I just have to point out, and it's from my own interests, on page 113, especially since this is what we're trying to work on now with juvenile justice, just a statement that said states are known by their courts and prisons, and contract labor systems are by their juvenile courts and parole systems. A change in penology may be an evidence of salvation. And that was just wonderful to read, because that's sort of what an area I'm working in now. So that was that. I don't think it furthers his intellectual. It was just a specific example that I resonated with.
Well, I think, again, there's a biblical basis for this. I mean, you've often heard about, you know, the claims of Jesus, that, you know, Jesus sets the captives free, right? And these captives are normally folks who are put into jail. And in ancient times, most often they're put into jail for financial reasons, you know, debtors' prisons and such like that. And so, you know, to reform the prison system and the system of social punishment is a primary means of bringing more justice to a society overall. And so that is squarely, yeah, this is that's one of his, I think, more powerful statements in this chapter. I did not lift that up. And it is fascinating to me that in this time, in 1917, when Rauschenbusch is writing this text, there's a big wave of prison reform that is going through our country. And it is at this time when we begin to speak more of a Department of Corrections than simply a Department of Punishment. And what does that mean? That means that they saw criminals as being, you know, redeemable, and they began to suggest that it was the duty of the state to actually provide means for them while they were incarcerated, so that when they come out, they have a chance of being better citizens. And so this was sort of part of the liberal movement of the early 20th century. So this is an important thing for you to lift up. I appreciate you lifting up that. Anyone else have an observation from chapter 11? And hello, Nicole Gray. It's great to see you.
Hello, Reverend Scott.
All right.
I have one.
You have them chapter 11?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Man, someone
Page-
comes like ready to go.
And, well,
Go ahead.
because I'm working on my theological statement,
Oh,
so I'm
cool.
taking notes. Okay, so on page 113.
Oh, yes. We were just there. Perfect.
So am I repeating what someone
No,
else
no.
said? A state which uses its superior power to overrun a weaker neighbor by force, or to wrest a valuable right of way from it by instigating a coup d'etat, or uses intimidation to secure mining or railway concessions, or to force a loan at usurious rates
Mhm.
on a half civilized state, is in mortal sin.
Yeah. That's powerful. I mean, and you figure that he's writing this just as the United States is beginning to embrace its identity as a colonial empire in
Yeah.
ways that it really hadn't before World War I. Go ahead and continue.
Well, so that was everything I wrote, but I guess the question I had for you, I wrote relative to this passage is, I was trying to translate it.
Yeah.
Like I was trying to say,
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? Like railway concessions, would that be like something related to the internet or something related? Like, how do I translate these very 1917, let's call them 1920-ish,
Sure.
like ideas and realities to 2021?
Yeah, because I think it's easier to understand when you think about physical space and geography. You know, I need that land because it lies between me and my major business partner. So I'm just going to find some way to take it so I don't have to pay you for the right of running my rail cars with my goods through it. So what could be a corollary of that today?
Keystone Pipeline.
Keystone Pipeline is a great one of that. That's exactly correct. It's going through what's supposed to be sovereign land without the permission of the sovereign residents up there in the Dakotas. I think the harder thing for us to conceive is when something like this is seized and it's not something that's physical and tangible, like some of the internet stuff you were leading to. You know, I think that's why we're starting to really understand, you know, the effects of Facebook, or are we supposed to call it Meta now? Don't get me started on that nonsense. Yeah. So what is the corollary between that kind of brutal coercion and seizure when it's virtual?
Right, and what does the 1% have to do with this? Like, where's that? Because basically the violence now is quiet violence that's happening in abstract spaces where capitalism is playing out, you know, and where wealth is being concentrated, like among, you know, a very small percentage of the population at the expense of the rest of the population. That's a mortal sin, right? But I guess the thing is, that's what this was talking about also, but we weren't at that level yet. It was still a very, I guess, basic industrialization stage.
That's fascinating to me. I think one of the reasons it's been easy for Google and Facebook and others to claim so much of the business landscape is because we don't understand it because it's they're not physical objects that they're owning or that they're occupying. They're occupying the space on the screens that we're looking at now. They're occupying our attention by always popping up on our phones. They're occupying something else in ways that seem to be dominating and freezing out other things that may have some legitimate claim to our attention.
And it's associated with wealth accumulation.
And the only reason they're doing it is because they're
Right.
trying to accumulate mass amounts of wealth, which they are. Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, Shirley's got a question.
Go ahead, Shirley.
Oh, sorry. So this is not quite as highfalutin, I guess, but it's the line. I'm on an iPad, so I can't tell you what the page numbers are.
Sure, is there a location?
Yeah, the process of Reformation, which stripped the church of its landed wealth and privileges, was nothing beautiful. That paragraph,
Yes, I know where that is.
it was high-class looting. Only a small portion of the wealth was used to endow education and charity. Most of it was seized by kings, princes, and nobles. This gave a new lease of life to autocracy, and in England set up some of the splendid aristocratic families who still consume what was once given to God. But this
Page
unholy,
160. Yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah,
go
but
ahead,
this
Ken.
unholy procedure did cleanse the church and its ministry of graft. When there were few large incomes, the rake-off perforce ceased. And the sentence, this is that I found interesting, is this sentence that comes. A body of ministers developed who were on the whole educated, clean, and willing to serve to the best of their understanding on a meager salary. This sentence just struck me in part because I love how, they were clean.
Well, there's a whole lot of stuff in that
Wow.
passage. So it's fascinating. So it's interesting because he is a part of that body of ministers that developed, and it seems rather self-serving, I might say, that it's almost a self-characterization. I
But it's
think
like Socrates and the philosopher king. Like this little paragraph, brought me back to that. Right? It's like the self-serving aspect of what he's saying here about a great profession has been saved. Poverty saved us. Yet salvation did not come from theology. You know what I mean? Like I found this just almost humorous in how it was so, I don't want to say narcissistic, but it was of a perspective that he made quite clear, right? Where he was coming
I would
from.
say paternalistic in a way, paternalistic or like there's this connection between God and these men.
Right. And poverty is the important part.
Okay.
so it's interesting because he says something which I think has a lot of resonance, that the process of Reformation, which stripped the church of its landed wealth and privileges, was nothing beautiful. And this is true. And the reason that Luther is able to gain so much power, or at least so much influence, is because the nobles and the princes of his time really wanted to have control of the land and the wealth that the church owned and controlled. So once Luther comes up with this justification of splitting from Rome, they jump at the chance because they don't want Rome telling them what to do in their backyard. And for the average prince who owns these lands and these buildings that are seized during the Reformation, they're not doing it for theological reasons. They're doing it for power and money. So the first part of that paragraph says something, I think, real, and then for some reason it goes into some kind of narcissistic self-affirmation. Yeah, I think you're spot on by finding it humorous, because there's a lot of that. The farther you get into this book, the more humorous, if not irritating, some of these arguments become, that's sort of why we're stopping at chapter 12, because there's not a whole lot for us after chapter 12, in my opinion.
And you've said he's a man of his time.
He's a man of his time,
Yeah.
who believes in a linear notion of progress through human history. So he believes he's describing the newest and cleanest, yes, and most advanced religion that humankind's come up with, because that's how, in his mind and in the mind of his era, human culture advanced in a straight line fashion. I think the First World War and a lot of the excesses of the 20th century, the Holocaust, gives chase to that myth pretty directly and violently. But here in in 1916, 1917, he was still able to hold on to that myth. Yeah. Fascinating. All right, can we move to chapter 12, or does someone else have something else they want us to laugh at or look at?
Please.
Yes.
The ideal, page 45 in the Kindle. The ideal of the poverty of the church, which was once common to men, someone like Saint Bernard, Arnold of Brescia, Saint Francis, and the democratic sects, must be understood over against the vested wealth, the graft, and the semi-governmental power of the church. Semi-governmental?
Right.
The church told the kings what to do. How is it semi? But my
Page
real
416.
question was over against? Is there a conjugation missing there? Like over and against?
Oh yeah, it was probably a more common to not use the and grammatically in his day.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, yep.
I've done a lot of
Contrast.
reading of from the late 1870s on, and normally their extraordinary sentence structure doesn't throw me for a loop, neither does their vocabulary, but that one threw me for a loop.
Yeah, so in contrast to the vested wealth and graft is probably a better contemporary way to say over against. Yep. I think you something for real. Yeah. And he has something, I think, that he's touching some kind of truth with that sentence too, you know. So yeah, it's fascinating to me. Yep, yep.
Yeah, the democracy of the early church is, it's not existent in very many Christian sects.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, you know, there's this romanticization of the ministry of the poor, and I don't mean to the poor, I mean of the poor. So you know, he has these grandiose expressions like the next to last paragraph in that chapter. The average minister will not be in doubt that he has married the lady poverty, and this keeps him from wantonness. So, you know, my understanding of being too much in poverty is sometimes it actually makes you do things that may not be deemed as not always 100% legitimate because you don't have enough resources to feed yourself or get healthcare. But that's another sermon, I imagine. So I do understand, you know, a sentiment there, but I think it's a tad too romanticized. Let's move to chapter 12. And he begins early in this chapter. And this is the first chapter where he's going on to really defending the church as an institution, which, you know, I don't really have an issue with. We're doing this in a congregational context. I don't have a problem with churches as institutions, congregations as institutions. But of course, this is where he really begins to rub against our universalism. You know, outside of the church, there is no salvation.
Bingo.
You know, and so, you know, this is one thing I think one thing that saves Unitarian Universalism from believing this nonsense is that we are universalists, that we believe that you know, all human beings have inherent worth and dignity and will be saved, whatever saving might mean, you know, upon their death and reunited with divinity. So, you know, we don't have to buy this, in other words, and I don't, and I urge you not to. You probably already don't, so that's probably good. So I'm going to pull up something here that I really want to look at for us. And this is location 1204 in the Kindle, and I will find the page number directly, because this is probably the most important piece here. And it begins, the paragraph begins, the church is the social factor. All right, so it's not too far in the chapter. Put it back. Church is the social factor. No, it's before that. It's really early on. Yeah, the church is the social factor. Yeah, right there. So it's page 119. The church is the social factor in salvation. It brings social forces to bear on evil. So I'm just going to stop it right there, because then he goes into Christian apologetics, which aren't as important for most of us. So what he's basically saying is that when people organize together, and he says elsewhere that it's impossible to do much good in this world unless you organize people, unless you have good people who are trained and devoted and organized for the common good. It's really hard to do a lot of good in the world. And so when he says the church is the social factor in salvation, you got to remember, he's always speaking of social salvation when he just uses the word salvation, unless he's going on an explanation about personal salvation in one of his apologetics to satisfy the conservatives that may be reading this book. So the church is the social factor in salvation, meaning that it's in the church that you're more likely to find people organized to try and make the world a better place. And so, this is what he's trying to say here in this. And, he's not denying that there aren't other groups out there trying to do the same, doing similar things. And what he's suggesting is that it's the church which brings social forces to bear on evil. In other words, think about some of our social justice work in this congregation. Think about some of the, more powerful social justice sermons that you may have heard delivered here. We're gathering a group of committed, devoted people who are united by covenant and serving a common mission to say, we have a problem in our society, and this is wrong. Whether we're talking about racism or homophobia or gender issues or anti-Semitism, whatever it is, poverty, homelessness, hunger, and it's in a church where we speak with power, with the voices of the ages, to say the world should not be this way, and we should be uniting our energy and power to make the world into a place that will be more than simply, what it is now, that we can do better, and is your duty to help make this better. So that's what I gather out of that phrase here. And so he begins to speak about that in contrast. When he's speaking about the church in this part of the book, he's talking about congregations and religious institutions who were organized knowingly to bring about justice and righteousness. And he's comparing that to other social organizations or a super personal being, which it's an interesting conception. Not many people besides him use this particular phrase. And later on in that same paragraph, he says a super personal being organized around an evil principle and set on predatory aims is the most potent breeder of sin in individuals and in other communities. So again, he's emphasizing the social collective nature of both righteousness and of sin, that whatever an individual does is nowhere near as dangerous as what a whole group of people organized for the wrong thing can do. And I've spoken from the pulpit before about groups that I feel were organized for the wrong principles. And some of those are obvious, but some of them might be less obvious. I mean, there are some religious institutions in this country that exist solely because they wanted to continue providing a theological justification for slavery, for instance. And it's my firm belief that if that's the reason you came into being, it's hard to become a force for righteousness and good. I believe that.
Which
firmly.
church is that?
Well, Southern Baptist is the most famous one, because there was an American Baptist Union before that, and in 1846, a lot of the northern churches began to stir up to become abolitionists, and of course the southern churches couldn't even conceive of that, and so they created their own denomination, and now that is the largest Christian denomination in this country, is Southern Baptist, and its germ of existence, its seed for coming into being, was to provide theological justification to say that God has willed slavery. That is why, that's why it took them until 1999 to even have any apology for slavery and for racism. And it was rather mealy-mouthed at that point. And that's why just this year, they went out of their way to ban and encourage the ban of teaching racism in virtually any context. You know, they probably used the buzzwords critical race theory, but they were also opposing their own organization's attempt from some of its more enlightened members to expose its awful past. You can't get away from what organized you in the first place. I strongly believe in the DNA of institutions. It's very hard for an institution to be redeemed. I believe human beings can be redeemed. I think it's really hard for institutions to be redeemed. That is my proclamation, not necessarily Rauschenbusch. I just want to make that clear. And so then he says, what might a superpersonal being do, which would be organized around justice? I'm paraphrasing from him. But so, you know, he's suggesting that, you know, he's reminding us that human beings always form groups. We always form organizations. We try to find people who have similar goals, ideas, visions of the world, a shared mission, and we're trying to live in such a way within those groups in ways that the group believes is good for the group. But when it is a group that's organized for justice and for healing, it would, and has its chief object to embody, you know, the good spirit and to do justice, that institution, that human organization has the potential to actually further justice in ways that no single person could. And so this is his whole notion of the superpersonal beings. I'm going to lift up just one or two more. In doing this, he suggests a lot of reasons as to why so many. Let me go back. Towards the end of that same section, it's the very next paragraph. If there had never been such an organization as the Christian Church, page 120, page 120. So he says at the end of that paragraph, you know, imagine how the presence of such a social group could quicken and balance the civil and political community. Our own Unitarian Universalism's own James Luther Adams, the ethicist and theologian who wrote the most in our movement in the 20th century, talked a lot about the necessity of voluntary organizations. And he's in part, and he meant, you know, religious institutions among them. And what he said is that the religious institutions are necessary to sort of stand for human dignity between the forces of government and the forces of commerce and the forces of popular culture, to remind us what is really most true, that religious institutions, when they are righteous, are doing the work of keeping us from jumping on board with the latest political movement that may actually be demeaning large classes of people. It's meant to stand as a bulwark against economic encroachment upon the lives of the poor. It's meant to keep us from being lost in frivolity amid cultural forces that are presenting to us things that just frankly waste our time and distract us. And I think we see that a lot today with what we were just talking about with like the internet and Facebook and that kind of public culture. Because he says at the end of the very next paragraph, he says, nothing lasts unless it is organized. And if it is organized of human life, we must put up with the qualities of human life in it. Meaning that, yes, any organization you're a part of is composed of human beings with all of their proclivities and their limitations and their tendencies to not always do or say the right thing. But we still need those organizations. You know, this is why congregational life can sometimes be messy, because we know what our mission is and we know what we're supposed to stand for, but not everybody here always lives up to the standards that we imagine they should. But what he's saying there is the overall mission of the institution has to be more important than the behavior of any one member in it. And we have to remember that whenever people that we're here with in the congregational life may not live up to the standards or do the things we think they should do. Because we're still, in the end, people, even though we're part of a larger organization. So all of that stuff, he goes on to talk rather eloquently in this chapter about the dangers of individualism. And this takes us back to the beginning of the book when he's trying to remind us how theology moved us away from that really biblical understanding that righteousness is the righteousness of the nation. That righteousness means that we're taking care of the poor and the widow and the immigrant and the orphan and the sick and the needy. And that the ancient Hebrew prophets were not speaking about personal salvation. They were speaking about national, civic, social salvation. And, obviously, since these religious institutions are part of a larger culture, it's easy for them to get co-opted and to be moved towards, thinking that, oh, I better not rock the boat or start preaching against the king or against the government or against the banker. I'm just going to teach about this personal, private thing. And he goes on and on to show how over time it was easy for religion to be pushed into an unfortunate pattern of individualism. That's all I have to say about chapter 12. What does anyone else want to lift up about chapter 12 before we move on to a little bit of Bible study? Yes.
So there was one part of chapter 12 that was the one thing I chose, a passage, and it completely amplifies what you just said. A fresh understanding for the indispensableness of the church is gaining ground today in Protestant theology, in spite of the increased knowledge of the past and present failures of the church. This is an attempt to overcome the exaggerated individualism into which Protestantism was thrust by the violent reactions of the Reformation. I'd never heard the Reformation called violent before, but I guess,
Sure. I think, violent has
Right.
a lot of different meanings. Sometimes it's not just, physical violence, but just intense churning and dislocation, right? So all that's appropriate. Yeah, I think what he had elsewhere reminded us that the thrust from a social understanding to a very isolated personal understanding was really contained in Luther's focus on justification by faith. And I think that's a good place for us to pivot, unless someone else has something else they want us to look at in this chapter 12. Does anyone have something else there?
I just
Yes.
had a quick question. I may have, well, I didn't kind of just skim today. My apologies. I didn't get all the way through in very
That's
much
all right. I
detail.
won't give you detention. It's okay. It's all right.
But I'm surprised I didn't see, when I think social gospel, my first verse I go to think of is Matthew 25, the book, Matthew, what you do unto others, you did for me. And how he very specifically says, I'm not talking about, and the sheep and the goats is nations, not individuals. So does he kind of flush that out or use that in his argument, or?
He goes more thoroughly into some of that. He doesn't really do as much proof texting as could have been beneficial, I think, to ground the argument. That's why I created this separate document that I did with some of the Bible passages that I know that he's basing these arguments on. And yeah, so I think, when you're speaking about, that awesome passage in Matthew when Jesus says, whatever you did, for the least of these, you did to me. And that is what created that notion that we serve the divine when we serve the needy, which was not begun with Jesus. That goes back to Isaiah and other of the Hebrew prophets. Yeah. No, I think you're spot on to recognize that and to be concerned why he doesn't develop that more. But I think, yeah, I'm not sure why he doesn't. Yeah, and I don't know all of his books. I know this one and the one before this, Christianity and the Social Crisis, pretty well, but the rest of them I don't know so well. So he may have developed that in articles or something. But anything else about that, Giancarlo?
Well, I know he doesn't specifically mention the whole linear growth of society, but I find it interesting because it's not linear anymore. It's, in terms of technology, it's exponential, and we're leaving. Like I read an article somewhere that 100 years ago we were in horses and buggies, and now we're in cars and going to space. It's just in the last century, it's taking off more than ever in history. So I'm wondering if some of it is lost in that context, in the application of today, or if it's more relevant.
There's a whole lot that's been written about and can be written and said about the notion that, our science and our technology always come before our moral understanding of how to put it into context. Our toys and our devices and our inventions always come before we understand their ramifications or their consequences and how to use them wisely and morally. And so you're very much reading something into that, into our experience these days that is very accurate. So I'm going to take a deep breath here for all of us. All right. And we're going to look at some Bible passages that try and say some things. And I'm just going to read a couple of them. In fact, I'll put this thing up on the screen as a screen share for you to use. And so you can see a couple of things I'm going to share. And yeah. And I shared this document, I think, on our first week or second week. If you can't find it, I can always resend it. And so, when we started this class, what I shared was that, like a good American Baptist, he's not a Southern Baptist, when he was confused about how the preaching that he saw and heard was not dealing with the misery in the world that he experienced, he went and read his Bible. And what he saw was that there's a lot of messages that seem to make it pretty clear how we're supposed to be as social creatures. And he saw that we were not living up to that ideal. And so these are just some of the passages that he lifts up. And we'll go through some of them more slowly, but I'm just going to read a few of these out loud to get, so you can hear them. And then we'll spend a little more time with the book of Isaiah and then end with James before we turn to a couple of things for the end of class. So here in Psalm 82, vindicate the weak and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. From Proverbs. And Proverbs is an interesting book. You may have had a hard time reading through it because it is literally what it says. It's a book of supposedly wise sayings. It is not a narrative. And it can be difficult to read all 30 chapters because 31 chapters because of that. There's no plot to follow, right? He who oppresses the poor to make more for himself or who gives to the rich will only come to poverty. He who oppresses the poor taunts his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him. The righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concern. He who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. And so I think many folks who are here in the Unitarian Universalist congregation, especially if you grew up in other religious systems, you may be here because you heard these Bible passages and you were wondering why the church you grew up in wasn't making this the focus of what they did. I was going to put that out there. You know, we can go to some more of these. From Deuteronomy, which is known as the second teaching, it's the priestly book of the Torah. You know, he executes justice for the orphan and the widow and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. You shall not pervert the justice due an alien or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment pledge. Cursed is he who distorts the justice due an alien, orphan, and widow. And all the people shall say, Amen.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you say that Deuteronomy is connected to the Quran or the Torah?
Torah.
The Torah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's the more priestly book. You know.
Got it. In the Old Testament, the Torah, which is the Hebrew.
First five books. Yeah. And
Okay.
and you know, and you know, like after Leviticus, it restates a lot of the Jewish law that was in Leviticus, and historically that means that the book of Leviticus was already everywhere, so they couldn't replace that book
Right.
in the 7th century when Deuteronomy was written. So they just rewrote it, you know, as if you were rewriting it for more modern ears.
Got it.
And it says very much the same thing as Leviticus in some ways. Anyway, so and then Micah, this is very famous. I actually did a whole sermon on this. Might have been 2 years ago, 2 Aprils ago, or last April. I don't remember. On Micah. You know, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? And I've always loved this because, you know, it says to do justice, you know, not to hope for justice or speak justice, but to do it, and to love kindness. Another interpretation is mercy as well. You know, so to be merciful and kind, and to walk humbly with your God. And when I did my sermon, I focused on that too. Like, it's not saying the one and only God, it's saying your God. And I think we can use it as Unitarian Universalists in that way. Whatever you find to be divine, I think to walk humbly with that is what gives you power. And then some of the other Hebrew prophets, Zechariah, Jeremiah, dispense true justice and practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother, and do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. Jeremiah 22, do justice and righteousness, deliver the one who has been robbed from the power of his oppressor, and also do not mistreat or do violence to the stranger, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood. Are we not seeing patterns over and over and over? Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. You know.
So they're saying the same thing in all these different ways, but again, it's the power of repetition and the power, like people have to constantly be reminded, right?
That's right. That's right. So I think if there's any powerful message for us to take from these ancient prophets, and how many of them speak to so many different times in the history of ancient Israel, it's so easy once we have power and wealth to ignore the right thing, to not do the right thing. It's so easy. We come up with all kinds of excuses to not do what we've been told is the right thing to do. And so the need for repetition. All of these prophets we read from lived in various different ages throughout history. We're going to go to Isaiah, and I don't have all of the Isaiah to put on the screen for you. Isaiah gives us in the first chapter, if you recall, I spoke about how Isaiah is the first book of prophets in the Hebrew scriptures, and it's put there for a number of reasons. And its very first chapter, like any good first chapter, is telling you the thesis, the main idea and mission of the entire section of the book. So learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. We hear this over and over, these same concerns. So elsewhere in the first chapter of Isaiah, it tells us that the nation shall be redeemed by justice, and the people in the nation will be redeemed by those who repent. In other words, we need to acknowledge our wrongs, and then we need to do something about them. We need to repair them. This is where the notion of atonement and reparation come from. That no matter what we can feel that we've done wrong, and we can say, oh, that was terrible, I hope I never do it again. But our duty as moral creatures is not complete until we have confessed our wrong and we have done something active to repair our wrong. It's very simple. There's nothing that difficult about any of this stuff to say and understand. It's not easy to do, which is why the prophets have to keep repeating it throughout history. Let's just do a couple more of these from the first 5 chapters of Isaiah. This is the most rich part of Isaiah for this kind of work. It says in 3:14, the Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people, saying, it is you who have devoured the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor? This is the Lord speaking directly to the powerful. Continuing on in chapter 5, 5:8. This actually may be a biblical injunction against corporate takeover and monopolies. Okay, I didn't think about that till I read it tonight in preparation.
Which
It's chapter 5, verse 8.
in Isaiah?
In Isaiah 5:8, it says, you who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is room for no one but you. In the midst of the land, the Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath. And so it's saying, careful with mass accumulation of wealth and power. It's telling us that the people are bowed down in 15. People are bowed down. Everyone is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are humbled. Because the Lord of hosts is exalted by justice, and the holy God shows himself holy by righteousness. For then only the lambs shall graze as in their pasture. Fatlings and kids shall feed among the ruins.
Isn't that also condemning corporate farming?
Yeah. Well, at least, yeah, I mean, it could be read that way, I would imagine. It's fascinating to me that, these injunctions that are just really, and Isaiah is the most popular prophetic book of Christianity because it's the one that Jesus cites most in the Gospels. There's one more bit here I'm hoping to find. And of course, it's in this part of Isaiah that the lion will lie down with the lamb, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and a child shall lead them. This is one of the most powerful sections of the entire Hebrew scriptures. Yeah, so to me, what does this all say? The easiest thing to suggest that it says is that there are a lot of assumptions about what the sacred scriptures are, but the things that are repeated the most, that are held up as the duty of a moral and righteous life, is the need to take care of the needy and the poor and the widow and the immigrant and the orphan and the sick. It's very clear. I don't know how anyone can read this text and not conclude that this is what the project of this religion or any religion based on this text should be. I just don't know how that's possible. Yeah. So let me just, two more things and then we'll open it up to a couple of other things. So I'll bring up this document again on the screen share. So we go from that and we go from Rauschenbusch's caution that we should not be focusing primarily on an individual isolated notion of spirituality. And the biggest contrast to that, besides in Matthew, not just the passage that Giancarlo had shared with us, that what you've done for the least among my people, you've done for me. Also, that the main commandment, the two main commandments are, love God, which means also God's righteousness. And what does it mean to be righteous? Love God with all your heart and your mind and your soul, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Those two in Matthew are considered the 10 Commandments boiled down into a two-line phrase. And then
Matthew what?
that's
Oh, it's
Matthew
in
22.
here. Okay.
Yes, Matthew 22:39 is
Got it.
that.
Okay, thank you.
And then James. So I'll pull this one up so we can read it as well as, we can see it as well as me reading it aloud. So this is from James. This is very famous. This is the epistle to James. So what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? This is, in direct contrast to the other notion that all we need is faith. What good is it if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. So I'm just going to stop here and invite any questions or observations from any of this stuff. This is a little different, sort of Bible study than I might normally do. I often prefer to, dig deeper and longer into just one or two passages. But to me, this broader survey was meant to provide, the reminder that the scriptural tradition is actually pretty clear as to what it means to be a moral agent and a bringer of righteousness in our society. Who's that? Deborah, go ahead. If you ever hear me not responding to you, just break in with just unmute yourself.
Yeah, no. I had thought early on in chapter 12 when he was painting a picture of, which as you always said, to remind us that, Jesus was not a Christian, that Christianity was not diffused into society. So it had to be placed somewhere. So it was placed in the church. And then I almost got the idea that the churches had to develop a lot of special rituals and meaningful things to help give people an identity about being Christian. And then it sort of went too far and people started to sort of reify the rituals and were they following the rules and lost sight of what Christ was, what Jesus's words were about. But
Yeah,
it made me understand that, you know, when there is, it's impossible to think of society not being infused with Christian talk or values. And so, but that didn't used to exist. So it sort of gave me some understanding for why it did exist. You had to go to the church or you weren't going to be saved, or, you know, they sort of needed those rules. Just an
So,
observation.
Yeah, I think you really lifted up a few things that resonate. I question the notion that there wasn't an understanding of Christianity, a social and cultural understanding of Christianity, because really until the Reformation, there was no notion of the separation of church and state. So no king in Europe was ever considered legitimate if they had not been ordained and christened by a pope, for instance, right? And so there was never that distance. And I think what he was referring to was the earliest days of Christianity.
Yeah, that's what I meant, in the very, very beginning.
Yes,
Right.
yes, before it was the religion of the Roman Empire. Yes, that's exactly right. And it lost its way. I mean, you know, it's interesting. It's one of the reasons that I always try and tread carefully, no matter how awful the political and partisan landscape becomes. I am very, very leery of aligning my work, this congregation's work, with the political party or a particular candidate. The history of religion and state power being united is just too instructive of how that just can lead to ruin and to us actually becoming the agents of everything we say we're against. And so I think you know that is often, that should be a touchstone for us, and we should be very careful in those assertions and those tendencies, as awful as, you know, some political parties seem to be at the moment. And so, yeah, that's why we normally talk about values and ideas and maybe a public policy position that's different than talking about a party or a particular candidate. But yeah, that's just a really difficult road to go down. And I don't think the destination down that road is full of righteousness, frankly. Yeah. So any other observations? I just wanted to go over a couple of things that I have, if there's no other questions or observations in this moment. Do you have something shared, or did you just pop up on my screen by mistake? Okay.
Yeah, I have something.
Good.
Kindle page 48, I believe. If we could observe a native Christian church and a pagan people after the Christian organization is once in operation as a social organism and is weaning families and village communities from pagan customs and assimilating them into new ideas, we should realize better the power of conservation exerted in our own communities.
Yeah, that's pretty heinous, isn't it?
From where I'm sitting, oh yeah.
Uh-huh. Yep.
There. Highlight as well.
Yeah. What page is that? 120. Yeah, it's somewhere. Yeah, it's again, Christian exceptionalism.
It's page 121.
Okay, 2021. Yeah, that's what it's yeah.
I mean, I understand that at the time he didn't know any better, but it still makes me wonder who died, made him God.
Say that and wonder what?
Who died and made him God, that he could determine what religion was most beneficial for any group of people.
It's not just paternalistic, it's also supremacist.
Very.
It's Christian supremacist, and it really leans hard into other supremacies, and that's why I've spoken a lot about that notion of inevitable progress, which actually was articulated, in Unitarian circles in the late 1800s, onward and upward forever. The fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, the discipleship of Jesus, and progress of humankind onward and upward forever was like a loose catechism of Unitarianism in the 1880s and 1890s. So this is definitely cultural, and it is part of that notion, especially in the United States. When the United States becomes very successful in the Industrial Revolution, and it starts to see itself as this new thing, this amalgam of all the world's peoples that's creating something brand new and better. It believes its own nonsense. And in many circles, it believes it in really dangerous and destructive ways. That is definitely true. And it's a sad thing. And they did not really understand pagan religions at the time. Anthropology was just kind of beginning. And so their notion was, part of the saving message of Christianity was that it also, quote unquote, civilized people. We know that's all a bunch of hooey now, but they believe that nonsense.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, and many of them still believe it today, unfortunately. Yeah, I hear you. And all right, so we're going to look just at a couple of things that I wrote, so you have an idea. And I shared this with you in the email last week, but I'm just going to read them to you tonight, just so you have an idea of what some writings about sin and salvation might be. And you can choose to use them or reject them or use them as a template or write something completely different from them because you find them they don't work, whatever. But I just wanted to give you some idea of some theological phrases. So when I've been asking you all, and however you're moved to do this, if you don't do it, it's fine. I still want you to come next week so we can talk about this stuff. But when you have a doc, remember that theology is a composite science, right? And in many ways, you have to start with some notion of human nature, some notion of cosmology. Let's see, what do I have up here? It's not here. Okay, here we go. So start with some preamble, and Chris Corbett was the one who made me think of this, because I just kind of said this and he's like, oh, that's a good way to start. And I had to remember what I said because I don't always remember what I say. As I do not claim a traditional understanding of God as a person or as some supreme cosmic source for all good, this doctrine focuses instead on what human beings are capable of and accountable to. Notions of divinity may or may not fit into this doctrine. So I just said that to encapsulate what I said. You don't have to say that, but sometimes talking about the limits and the focus of anything you write like this will help the reader be able to read it more deeply and access what you're really trying to say instead of rejecting it right away, if that makes any sense. And so I just started riffing on this. I think I wrote all these Sunday morning just off the fly. I just got on the roll because I wasn't preaching that morning, so that's why I had time to think and write. So sin, many ways it's been defined, missing the mark, doing what we know is wrong, bearing false witness, stealing when what is stolen is not necessary for survival, the physical, emotional, sexual, or economic abuse or exploitations of persons, knowingly contributing to destruction or needless death, refusing to follow the commitments and covenants we've sworn to uphold, willful disregard for humanity or persons, treating people as means to an end, and instead of as ends in themselves, allowing greed, convenience, lust, will to power, or other unholy motivations to be our only justification. And then I started to speak more anthropologically. Sin is a human enterprise and as such is explained in human terms. Though our notion of God may suggest God may abhor sin, as universalists we do not believe human beings are punished for sin after death. Sin is how we make life miserable for one another, the planet, and all living things here on earth. So I just want to I want to give you a sense of what some short sentences or phrases, could sound and feel like as you might write your own.
So do we have to reference this? So yeah, I've started working on mine, but do you need to attribute all of this, or is it okay to, you gave the guidance on what the, what theology it should be based in texts, or common understanding. Like there were a few different acceptable sources, science, but I guess the question that I have is, do you need to reference that, or,
Not for this assignment. I mean, if you're
Okay.
ever to publish it, you would want to
Right,
reference it,
okay.
right? And actually for a broader conversation, it would be nice to source where you get the ideas from or what else is
so as
echoing
much as
what you're saying.
possible,
But you don't need to do that for next week necessarily,
Okay.
But if you do, you will get extra credit, Nicole, because I know you love extra credit.
Extra credit.
All right, so salvation. As universalists, our tradition's insight is that all shall be saved. That hell is a fable meant to show us the potential human beings have to create misery and death. Obviously, I didn't proofread this much. Our faith teaches that all people possess inherent worth and dignity, no matter how distant from that origin many people act in any time or in any age. Right? Universalism teaches that since there is no hell and no Satan, no cosmic source of ultimate evil, then salvation is understood in some religious systems does not apply to humanity. There is no hell to be saved from, in other words. A truly loving God would never condemn us to suffer for eternity for sins committed here on earth, as we possess incomplete knowledge and cannot always predict all the outcomes of our actions. This is right out of Hosea Ballou, the famous universalist. And this next phrase is basically one of his. I don't think he says it just like this, but God's love knows no limits. Human love, however, is significantly limited. Over time, people have painted God with a nasty brush and projected the most vile and cruel notions of the human mind onto the heart and will of God. Yes, human beings want those who do us wrong to suffer. To say this is the will of God is to conflate the human and the divine, and to blaspheme God by making God a monster. And that is also Lulu. He says it the most powerfully, though in many more words. In this context, salvation is what promotes, proclaims, protects, and perpetuates human thriving. Salvation is defined by what minimizes death, meanness, misery, exploitation. Salvation is what saves us from error, what helps us know ourselves, the world, and society more clearly and accurately. Salvation as such requires courage. Salvation is a moral accomplishment because it makes us be honest with ourselves and to correct our errors and our destructive ways so as to build a better world and life together. Salvation and its earnest seeking is a prerequisite for beloved community and social justice. Salvation requires honesty, confession, atonement, deliberate seeking of love and restoration of relationship, and reparation. Active attempts to pay for our wrongs in ways the wronged find meaningful. Salvation assumes covenant and commitment and seeks to restore, maintain, and nurture relationships where relationships will not place us in harm's way. All right. And I'm going to stop there. I wrote some more, but there's no reason to go on. A result of the same. All right. So what did you think about all that nonsense? I'll take down the screen share. What did you think about all that? Was that just too much gobbledygook?
Gave me a jumping off point. Although those words are not really in my real spiritual vocabulary.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree with Cher. It's like I've been in this congregation for 30 years, and I don't think I've ever encountered sin and salvation that I remember in it, so no, what you wrote was just great. It's just like, I don't know that I can have any thoughts. I feel very new at this, that's it.
So maybe your newness is what's going to provide the innovation that makes other people understand it.
I really liked that, and it informed, like, my process is similar to that, but not obviously like your process. But I started with this idea that sin can be an act of commission, or sin can be an act of omission.
That's good.
And so I saw that you wrote about disregard, and I wrote about negligence, like kind of even benign indifference,
Mhm.
right? I mean, lack of action is a profound sin.
Mhm.
When there's the ability to do something to relieve suffering in others or to prevent suffering or tragedy.
Yeah, I did the wrong that I shouldn't, or I didn't do the good that I could have. Yeah, I don't know who wrote that. I think it might be Saint Augustine, but yeah, I mean, that's a very classic, and writing something like that is something that, you know, folks from other religious traditions would definitely see as, you know, theological writing. Yep, that's good stuff. Yeah, so yeah, I'm really going to be interested to see, you know, what folks can come up with, but you know, I want you to write about sin and salvation first, and then if you prefer to write about something else and use different terms, that's fine. But you know, one of my biggest problems with Unitarian Universalists is they never want to do the assignment the way it's given the first time around. So they want to question the question before they try to answer it. So I'm just being honest about that. So I encourage you to engage the question as it's asked, and then if it just isn't working for you, then to do it your own way. So that's all. You know, just give it a try. And if it doesn't work, I get it.
So the
I'm
broad
not saying it should
outline
work. You know,
is, number one is overview, right? Number two is what is sin? Number three is what is salvation?
Mhm.
And number four is summary.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. And I
Isn't
think
that the assignment, or
and
that's just an interpretation?
that's a good structure to use in anything like this. And of course, since we've been reading Rauschenbusch, you know, make sure that you're speaking of the social component. I think that the main reason I taught this class is I wanted to open us up to conversations about sin and salvation, because we've been conditioned in this country for the last 60 years that sin and salvation are really just between me and Jesus. And that is actually not what the Bible teaches, right? So that's the whole purpose of this class. So make sure that whatever you write at some point, doesn't have to be the whole thing, it's dealing with the social component of all this. All right, is this clear? As clear as it can be. It's clear, so long as it's a little bit clearer than mud, I'll be happy.
It's clear as coffee.
So in terms of the units, so we have those books, you know, just from the book that we got when we became members, and then the other book. I have a few Unitarian books, but is there a resource that we can use besides the UUA website to gain insight to different Unitarian?
There's not a lot of
theologians?
contemporary writing much about these issues outside of Rosemary Bray McNatt, who actually was an intern here.
Okay.
Really wonderful African-American minister who's now the president of Star King School for the Ministry. She writes a lot about evil.
What's her name again?
Rosemary Bray McNatt with 2 T's.
Thank you.
And so she writes about evil. It's mostly in articles from the UU World from the early 2000s. She writes eloquently that we need a new doctrine of evil after 9/11. She was part of the trauma response ministry, helping people after the terrorist attacks. And she said, we need to be able to speak plainly about things that are so wrong that there's no other word for them but evil. So
Wow.
yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Anyway, so there you go. So I think, you know, all this stuff is just the churning. If you're looking for other writing about it, you're going to have to go to something before the 1940s mostly.
Okay.
We got away from these doctrines for a while, I think, but that's another class. But it's 8:31. I want to honor the discipline of time. We started 7 minutes late, so I figure we're ending 6 minutes early.
Maybe we can publish this. Maybe we can publish this in
Oh, it would be great.
in the UUA journal. Like we can, you know, find a way in. Like,
If we could publish this, you would make me the happiest doggone professor in the history of.
oh, we could put this thing together.
In the history of ministry?
No, the history of. Well, you would just make me very happy, very proud papa. All right, so you know, so Nicole has already claimed that we're going to have this published in the UU World. So no pressure for your
No
homework.
pressure. Well, we'll
But
find an
seriously.
interesting way to synthesize everything. And I think the framing for this is, you know, even though we're in this time period, right? RE and adult RE in particular
Mhm.
continues to thrive.
Mhm.
And, you know, what better time to write about something as foundational as what is sin and what is salvation
Mhm.
from the perspective of you,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And to understand the social implications of that as they've been laid bare for us during the pandemic in
Yeah.
terms of, you know, who dies, who
Mhm.
lives. So I think that's the way in. I mean, in terms of the article, in terms of the pitch, but, you know, I guess my concern is it's only being published 4 times a year now. But I
There are other venues and they do stuff online and on blogs. Let's just worry about that once we have something.
got it, okay.
But the other thing that I should share with you is, you know, whatever you come up with is going to be useful to further your understanding and further our understanding if you share it with us. So, you know, I really, you know, cherish the opportunity to read what you all might come up with. And furthermore, I just really would love to say, you know, that, you know, this has been a project of mine, you know, since I decided to become in the ministry. You know, in very real ways, I really feel like, you know, my life was improved so much that I could say that my life was saved by Unitarian Universalism. And I'm very comfortable saying that we have a life-saving faith. And so I need a doctrine upon which to base that. And I've been working on it for years and haven't really ever spent the time to really flesh it out in a way that's systematic or easy to share. And so, you know, really just last Sunday morning, just the work that you have inspired, you know, doing with me in this class is where I started doing this writing in a more thorough way, actually, you know, for the first time, at least in a couple of years. And you know, I think it's it's anything that keeps us from wasting our time and talent and treasure, anything that keeps us from, you know, error, anything that keeps us focused on creating the best world we can, you know, in tangible and real ways, is a saving path. And that's what I have always meant when I say that this is a life-saving faith, and I mean it. And so it's interesting now to be here working with you all on this. And so thank you for that. Without any further ado,
I think Shirley just wanted to say.
Shirley, go ahead, Shirley.
Oh, I mean, you know, I've been thrown a challenge really. And this work is, you know, kind of timely in its own way. So at my university, they have this big thing over the Christmas holidays, right? And it's called like it's like the Canterbury group or something, the Anglican group. They do this thing called 9 lessons and carols or something.
Yep.
Yeah. So I was asked to be a reader at this. So my response was, well, I don't know, because they know I'm a Unitarian Universalist and I'm really clear. And I said, my understanding of a lot of these things, or my faith, is not the same. So, and they're all, but they want it to be all diverse and all this sort of thing, right? And I said, but I don't want to read any passages or anything that isn't true to my own faith. And so, you know, of course, there are, everybody's politically correct these days, you know. And so he said, well, he said, I'm going to send you the lessons and you can read them. And if there is a passage that is, you know, that would be, you know, appropriate and in keeping with your own tradition in some way, you can read that one. And so I just got it today. I was just sent it. I haven't even opened it yet. And I'm like sitting here thinking like, oh my God, like they've really like said, yeah, we really want you to participate in this thing. So we're giving you, you know, choice. And so I don't know. You know, I'm looking at, I just don't know. I mean, I'm going to look at it and think about it. But it's also part of my own personal mission is to make people understand that Unitarian Universalists Catholicism is a faith, and that we have beliefs, and that they have to be honored like everybody else, because I'm really tired of people doing this thing where they go, oh, well, you're Unitarian Universalist, so, whatever. I know you don't care, or it's fine, right? Anything goes, but it doesn't. And I think this exercise in talking and using words like salvation and sin, though they're not comfortable words for us, I think they're timely. And, I've been so anyway, I'm just thinking about all of this right now. Just like that passage that we read of Isaiah, about, because there's a lot of things going on at work, period. And the sadness of that whole thing of how people come together and they say what they have to say, and it doesn't matter. It's all going to come to naught anyway. So it was very sad. But anyway, so I just throwing that out there. And if you have any familiarity, Reverend, with these 9 passages or lessons, and whether or not I'm going to be able to find anything in them that I want to read, I, love to talk to you about.
No, I appreciate that. I've actually done more than one, lessons and carols style service. And they weren't all Bible passages. There's, if you're not able to suggest a reading of your own, then you are going to have to find one that you're comfortable reading with authenticity.
Right.
One of the ones I love reading, you've heard me read in Christmas Eve before, is A. Davies' Christmas Always Begins at Midnight, which is an amazing passage, which just talks about, that this was a humble birth, and, there was no reason to think that there was anything special about this person, and yet, Davies just unpacks it so beautifully. If you send me an email, I can find it and probably send it, the thing to you. Maybe you'll find it yourself with a Google search. But there will be a couple of them in the traditional lessons and carols that you should be able to do with authenticity. So read them and see if there's one that doesn't go too deep into the claims about Jesus. That's always the problem, right? Does it have to be virgin birth? Does it have to be all these miracle things? Why can't we just talk about the example of his living with authenticity? So yeah, I totally get that, and I'm willing to help you with that. I really want you to be able to do that, and I appreciate you being an evangelist for doing this work. So we'll see. Maybe we'll talk together on the other side of this. Maybe we present our ideas in a Sunday service sometime. I'm sure it will definitely provoke a lot of conversation. So anyway,
Yeah.
Hey, he didn't say worship service. Hallelujah.
So wait, Sarah, you'll appreciate this. The word
okay.
worship comes from the Old German, which simply means to shape worth or to shape
I
meaning.
gotta go.
So if you want to think of it, in the
But that's not the current understanding of it, and I don't bow my knee to any deity.
Fine. Anyway, well, I will worship our time together, and say goodbye until next week. And I love you all very much for doing this. Thank you.
I thank you.
Thank you.
There, Foxy.
Bye.